So this is the PowerPoint for Chapter 1, which is an introduction to human anatomy and physiology. And this chapter covers some real basic tenets of what anatomy and physiology is and introduces you to lots of vocabulary terms that you need to memorize. So first of all, what were the origins of A&P? Really, if we look back, it certainly has to do with people's concerns about health, and therefore is tied closely into medical sciences. Now, early on, it wasn't as scientific, though, of course. The early healers depended on superstition and magic, and then they started observing things about injuries and wound healing and even dead bodies, which told them a lot of things. And over time, it did evolve into more experimentation. And so we started understanding how to study things properly using scientific method. We did create a whole new set of terms for anatomy and physiology that we use to this day. And a lot of it's from the original Latin. Finally, the study of corpses and cadaver dissection did bring new knowledge of the human body. And as I said, with the advent of scientific method, we had a much clearer path on how to study things properly. Okay, some terminology. Well, what is anatomy and physiology? Anatomy is a study of the structure, morphology of the human body and its parts, and it's derived from the Greek for cutting up. Physiology is a study of the functions of the human body and its parts, and it's derived from the Greek for relationship to nature. The structure of organs and parts of the human body determine function. And one thing we say in A&P all the time is function follows form. Okay, the way something is structured tells us something about the way it acts or works. And things are structured a certain way, so they do have a certain action or function. Individual structural variations do occur in some people, and in such structures like blood vessels, bones, reproductive organs. Okay. Now, one thing we always talk about at the beginning of this course is the levels of organization, and we mean small to large. Okay, so and you can study science at any of these levels, but really you have to kind of understand all of it to understand any of it to some degree. So subatomic particles. So that's the smallest level: protons, neutrons, and electrons, and those make up an atom. And an atom is the tiniest particle that make up chemical, like hydrogen or carbon. And when we put atoms together, we form molecules, like water and glucose. Now we can also put molecules together and form macromolecules, which means large molecules, like DNA, protein, carbohydrates, lipids. We'll be talking more about those later on. And when you have a bunch of macromolecules that get together, you then form an organelle. That's the functional part of a cell, like a mitochondrion or a lysosome or the nucleus. When you put several organelles together, working together, then you finally get the cell. That's the basic unit of structure and functions. Muscle cells, nerve cells, blood cells, lots of different types. And we'll be going through all of those. A group of cells that works together for a common function is called a tissue. For example, adipose tissue or epithelial tissue. If you put different tissues together, you then get an organ, like a heart, kidney, or stomach. Now, certain organs work together for some common functions, and then you get organ systems, like the digestive system. And you put all those organisms or those organ systems together, and eventually you get the organism. And in this case, the human, which is what we're studying mostly. Okay, and this shows you those different levels pictorially. Okay, now throughout this textbook, there are clinical applications that try to tie in some of the things that we study in the chapter to the real world as much as possible, and to latest science and how we study these things in a clinical situation. And it's not always easy to study, especially the soft tissues, but now we have ultrasound and magnetic resonance imaging. In the ultrasound, we have high frequency sound waves, and they give an image of a soft internal structure. And it's used to obtain sonograms of a fetus in the uterus, for example. And then there's magnetic resonance scans or magnetic resonance imaging. These make use of magnetic fields, and they change the alignment and spin of certain types of atoms. And this provides a high resolution image of certain internal structures like the brain. Okay, moving forward, core themes in anatomy and physiology. Well, the cell certainly is one of the core themes, because all living things consist of a cell, and it's kind of the base level at which we often operate when we're trying to determine how something works. And then we can talk about the internal environment, and that's the environment within the body, and that's what we're always trying to keep in homeostasis, which means at a constant internal environment. We also talk about the dependency of the cells to each other, and this is an interdependency of the cells. And then finally, we talk about the relationship between structure and function and an interrelatedness. Okay, there's some underlying mechanisms and processes we'll talk about, like gradients and permeability. So cells move basically from high to low concentrations, or down pressure gradients, or down concentration gradients, or across permeable membranes. In this case, we're talking about chemicals moving across it. So that it's just kind of a very common scientific principle. We'll talk more and more about things like diffusion. Cellular differentiation, this is specialization of cells because of what genes are turned on in those cells in particular to perform a certain function. There are certainly cell membrane mechanisms we'll talk a lot about. These determine whether certain substances enter or not, and whether a cell can respond to certain signals. And then there is cell-to-cell communication, and that is through the membrane receptors. Okay, we do have feedback loops. This is a homeostatic mechanism trying to keep things stable. So if something gets too high, we try to lower it. If it gets too low, we try to raise it. So we're always trying to reach a balance ultimately. So we want to replace any lost substances, and we want to eliminate any of the excesses. And then we'll certainly talk quite a bit about energy processes that keep cells active, which keep cells alive. Okay, in biology, we often say that life has certain aspects to it, certain characteristics. And these are some of the things we say have to be exhibited by something for it to be considered alive. So growth, that's an increase in cell number and size, an increase in body size. Reproduction, production of new cells and organisms. Responsiveness, that's a reaction to a change inside or outside of the body. And movement, which is a change in the body position or location or motion of internal organs. Also, living things conduct metabolism. In a nutshell, metabolism is the sum of all chemical reactions in the system, and we're mainly talking about energy production, nutrient cycling. So some components of that include respiration. I'm talking about cellular respiration, where we make energy from glucose, basically. Most organisms do it by taking in oxygen, and then they give off carbon dioxide. Digestion, of course, you've got to break down the food components into usable nutrients. Circulation, you've got to move the chemicals around and the cells through the body fluids. And then excretion, you've got to remove the waste products. Okay, organisms do require certain things. And you probably could have thought of several of these without even reading this, but living things need water and food, and many of them need oxygen and heat and pressure. Now, some of the chemicals we talk about include water, food, and oxygen, and water is the most abundant substance in the body. You have to have it as an environment for the metabolic processes to occur in, both what we consider intracellular and extracellular fluids, and that means fluids inside the cell and outside the cell. Water is required for transport of substances through the human body, and water is necessary to regulate body temperature. Okay, food, as I said, is another chemical. It provides nutrients to supply energy, and then oxygen is a major requirement to help release energy from the food when we talk about cellular respiration. Okay, other requirements of organisms. Heat, that is a form of energy, and it helps maintain body temperature. It partly controls the rate of metabolic reactions. If the temperature is too cold, enzymes don't work, and so reactions can occur. And also if it gets too hot. Pressure, that's the application of force on an object. We can talk about atmospheric pressure, just the air pressing in around us, and it's helpful in our breathing. Oxygen goes into our body. And then hydrostatic pressure as well, that keeps blood flowing, like hydrostatic pressure from the heart or your muscles pushing on your blood vessels. As I said, homeostasis is very important when we talk about living things. It's about maintaining a stable environment. Homeostatic mechanisms are self-regulating systems that monitor aspects of the internal environment, and they correct them as they need. There's three parts to a homeostatic mechanism. You have the receptor, which detects and provides information about the stimuli. Then you have the control center, which is the decision maker that maintains a set point. And then the thing that does something about it, the effector, the muscle or gland that responds to the control center and then causes the necessary change in the internal environment. And as you can see, this is just a continuous cycle. Now, there are different feedback mechanisms that allow homeostasis to occur. And the most common type of homeostatic mechanism is negative feedback. Now, that doesn't mean it's a bad thing. This means it always brings it back to a set point. So effectors return conditions toward normal ranges and conditions, and the deviation from the set point will lessen. It's called negative because the response to the change moves the variable in the opposite direction of the deviation from the set point. It prevents sudden severe changes in the body. Example, negative feedback controls body temperature, but also blood pressure and glucose levels in the blood. This is a model that compares the thermostat in your household to the one in your body, and they do the same thing. So the stimulus is actually the temperature, either rising or lowering, and the receptor is in your body, the thermoreceptor, of course, at your house, it's thermostat. You have a control center at your home. The thermostat also is the control center in your body. The hypothalamus of the brain is. It sends out information to effectors. Those are the things that are going to make a change. Okay, in your home, the heater turns off or turns on, or air conditioner turns on or off. Again, in this example, we're saying temperature is too high, so it's going to turn air on and heat off. In your body, skin blood vessels will dilate, which help let the heat off, and you sweat more. Okay, and then of course the opposite things happen if you get too low with temperature. Again, the hypothalamus kicks in, and in your body, your muscles might start contracting involuntarily, or what we call shivering, and then blood vessels will constrict to kind of protect the temperature inside the body to keep it from releasing as much heat. Okay, positive feedback, it's the opposite. And there's only a couple of examples in the human body. It's uncommon, as I said. It's a change or deviation where it's intensified instead of reversed. And the activity of the effector is increased initially. Now, it usually does come back. It's short-lived. It produces temporary unstable conditions. Okay, examples, blood clotting or uterine contractions during childbirth. And the example this textbook uses for positive feedback is like a microphone sending a stronger electric signal to an amplifier, which increases the electrical signal, and then that amplified sound goes back into the microphone again, and so it's continually being louder and louder and louder, and they control that, or they compare that to the uterus contracting, which causes more contractions, which causes more contractions. Okay, so all of these things work together, all organ systems work together for homeostasis to try to keep things even. All your systems work together. Okay, let's talk some key terminology. You do have to memorize these terms. The human body consists of two main portions, the axial portion and the appendicular. The axial is the head, neck, and the trunk of the body. The appendicular portion is upper and lower limbs. The major body cavities of the axial portion include the cranial cavity, where the brain is found, the vertebral canal or spinal cavity, where the spinal cord is found. Then you have a thoracic cavity that houses the lungs and the thoracic viscera. And when we say viscera, we mean organs. And the abdominal pelvic cavity that contains abdominal and pelvic viscera. Or you might hear people say viscera. Either is fine. Okay, the diaphragm. This is the muscle that separates the thoracic and abdominal pelvic cavities. So it's right underneath the lungs. The mediastinum, this is the region between the lungs and the thoracic cavity, which contains the heart, but also the esophagus and trachea and your thymus gland. The abdominal pelvic cavity contains two portions. You have an abdominal cavity that extends from the diaphragm to the top of the pelvis and contains the stomach and the liver and spleen and kidneys and small intestine and most of the large intestine. The pelvic cavity is enclosed by the pelvic bones, and it contains the end of the large intestine, the urinary bladder, the internal reproductive organs. Okay, this picture shows the major body cavities. You need to get to know these. There's also smaller cavities in the head, like the oral cavity, nasal cavity, orbital cavity, and middle ear cavities. And that's shown here in this picture. And you can very easily guess what is basically in those cavities, or what they're related to anyway. Now, organs and the cavities rub together, and that can cause a lot of friction. Therefore, we need something to help keep the friction from damaging your internal parts. And that's where serous membranes come into play. And they produce serous fluid, and this makes it a slippery surface. Okay, so the serous membranes consist of two layers. There's what we call a visceral layer, which covers the organ, and a parietal layer that covers the cavity. And we have specific names depending on where they are. Like the serous membrane around the lungs, that's called the pleura, or you can say pleural membranes. But the visceral pleura is the membrane that covers the lung itself, and parietal pleura is the membrane that covers the cavity. If we're talking about the heart, then we talk about pericardium. So the visceral pericardium is on the heart, the parietal pericardium is on the cavity. And again, we can also call this pericardial cavity. And then the visceral and parietal peritoneum. These are any of the serous membranes around your organs of your abdominal pelvic area. So it covers several organs. Okay, this is a cross section at the top of your body, going through the lungs and the heart. and it shows those membranes around the lungs and around the heart. And as you can see, there's 2 layers for each. Again, a visceral layer, parietal layer, visceral layer, parietal layer. And again, the ones around the heart are called pericardium, and the ones around the lung are called pleura. That's found over here, pleura. If we go down through the abdominal pelvic area, then again, you see several organs, and all of those have the membrane on them. We call all of those peritoneum. So again, visceral, parietal, peritoneum. Okay, now let's talk about organ systems. And you need to go ahead and get to know these pretty well at the beginning and the major organs in them. You don't have to know everything about them yet, just what they are, what they do, and what are the major organs. The integumentary system, we're basically talking about skin, hair, and nails. It's a body covering, protection, body temperature regulation, sensory reception, production of vitamin D. The skeletal system, so we're talking about bones, support and movement, framework, protection, attachment sites, storage of inorganic salts, production of blood cells. So the skeletal system does a lot more things than most people think. The muscular system, it's for support and movement. It's the main source of body heat, of posture. So we're talking about skeletal muscles here. Okay, the nervous system, brain, spinal cord, peripheral nerves. It's for integration and coordination of organ function through nerve impulses and neurotransmitters with chemicals. Rapid short-term effects when it comes to the nervous system. And the endocrine system, it's also for coordination and integration, but it works through chemical messengers we call hormones. It's slower but longer lasting. Okay, and when we talk about the endocrine system, we're talking about certain glands, we're talking about certain parts of reproductive structures, we're talking about the hypothalamus of the brain, pituitary gland, thyroid gland. Okay, organ systems for transport, cardiovascular, transportation of gases, nutrients, blood cells, hormones, and wastes. And then kind of parallel to the cardiovascular system is the lymphatic system, which is a bunch of tubes. It's for the transportation of fluids from tissue spaces to the blood. It carries fats from the digestive system to the blood. It also defends the body against infection. It's an important part of your immune system. It's the lymph glands and the lymphatics, which are the vessels. Okay, the digestive system. It receives food, breaks down food, absorbs digestion products, excretes waste. So we're talking about the stomach, small intestine, large intestine. Then we have the respiratory system. It moves air in and out of the body. It exchanges gases, oxygen and carbon dioxide in particular, between the blood and air, and it absorbs oxygen. And then we have the urinary system, which removes blood waste, regulates electrolyte and water balance and blood pressure, produces urine, and excretes it by transporting it to the outside the body. And the reproductive system. Male and female systems produce and transport sex cells, produce hormones, they produce new-like organisms. And the female also provides for fetal development and childbirth. Okay, table 1.3 is a good table to get to know. Okay, now each of the chapters in this particular textbook always end with lifespan changes. They tell you how things change as a person gets older. So they should give you some general things here at the beginning. Of course, aging occurs from the microscopic to whole body level. And so you got hair losing pigment, becomes gray or white, skin wrinkles due to decrease in subcutaneous fat, skin stiffens due to decrease in collagen and elastin, the percentage of fats in the tissues increase, Joints develop stiffness. Elevated blood pressure may progress to hypertension. Elevated blood glucose may progress to type 2 diabetes mellitus. Tissues atrophy and organs shrink. Cells reach the end of ability to undergo cell division as they lose the tips of the chromosomes. A metabolic rate decreases. Decreased production of enzymes and other proteins happen. And some people may develop dementia or Alzheimer's disease. Okay, now we've gotten through some of that major part at the beginning. Let's hit the vocabulary again here at the end. When we're talking about anatomy, we need to assume that the body's in a particular position so that we're all on the same page. So anatomical position is standing erect, facing forward, upper limbs at the side, palms facing forward. And anatomical terms of any relative position are being based on a person standing in the anatomical position. Okay, so this is the anatomical position. And let me go ahead and say, when you talk about right and left, it's always from the perspective of the model or the patient. Okay, not your left and right, but it is the patient's left and right. That's important. Okay, some terms of relative position. Superior means above, inferior means below. Anterior or ventral means towards the front. Posterior dorsal means towards the back. Medial means towards the midline, and lateral means away from the midline or to the sides. Bilateral means it's paired structures on both sides, kind of like kidneys. Ipsilateral means certain things are on the same side. Contralateral means opposite sides. Proximal means close to the point of attachment to the trunk. Distal means farther from the point of attachment to the trunk. So we use proximal and distal when we're talking about parts of your arms and legs. Superficial means close to the body surface. Deep means more internal. Okay, and this is a good figure to look at to help remember those terms. Okay, body sections or planes. This is important because a lot of times in the textbook, you'll see certain types of pictures or cuts of organs or organ systems, and you need to understand what the perspective is. A sagittal section is a longitudinal cut that divides the body into left and right portions. If we say mid-sagittal or median section, we mean we're dividing the body into an equal left and right portion. Now, some pictures will divide the body into a left and right, but not exactly in the middle, and that's parasagittal. Okay, transverse or horizontal section that divides the body into superior and inferior portions. A coronal or frontal section is a longitudinal cut that divides the body into an anterior and posterior portion, or a front and a back. And this is a good diagram to get to know, to understand the body sections. And this also shows you the difference when we look at a particular organ and its section, like a brain. Okay, sometimes you have cylindrical organs and we have special cuts of those. Like a cross section means a cut across the structure. Oblique means angular. Longitudinal means a lengthwise cut. And a bone is a good example of something we might show in that kind of cut or section. Or some other tubular thing like maybe the small intestines. Okay. Now, doctors will often ask you where you hurt, or they may try to hear certain noises in certain parts of your abdominopelvic areas. And so we have special terminology for those different parts. So if it's more broad, if we just divide the abdominopelvic area into 4 parts or quadrants, we will use abdominal quadrants: right upper, right lower, left upper, left lower. So you just write out RUQ, RLQ, LUQ, LLQ. Abdominal region is a little more specific. we actually have basically 9 different abdominal regions. The epigastric is the upper middle. Hypochondriac's on the right and left sides of the epigastric region. Umbilical is central. Lateral or lumbar is on the right and left sides of the umbilical. Pubic is, or hypogastric, another term there, lower middle portion. And inguinal or iliac is on the right and left side of the pubic region. So by the way, different textbooks use different terminology. Okay, this is a couple of good pictures to get to know. Okay, and then we get to anterior and posterior regions. Lots of terminology here. Some of it makes sense, some doesn't. You do need to get to know all of these terms. And I'm not going to go through all of them. I'll just name a few. Like the ear, the area of the ear is the otic, nose, nasal, mouth, oral. So some of those you've definitely heard of. Some you may not have, though, like the point of the shoulder, we call it a acromial region, or the armpit is axillary. The upper arm, brachial. In front of the elbow, antecubital. Of course, abdominal, you know. Antebrachial means in front of the arm, so it's the forearm. As we move down the leg, the front of the lower leg, crural region. Toes are digital. Fingers are digital as well, by the way. Looking at the back of the body, back of the head, occipital. Brachial, again, upper arm. Cubital is the elbow. Notice that that's cubital, and the front of the elbow is antecubital. So A-N-T-E often means in front of or before. Down at the bottom here, sural is the calf, that's that region. Calcaneal is the heel. Plantar would be the sole. Okay, so do get to know those terms. Start working with those as soon as you have time to. By the way, at the end of some of these slides, there are a little bit more terminology or specific verbiage that goes with the figures. And if you want more details related to those figures, you may want to read that information on there. Of course, there's never an alternative really for reading the textbook. So make sure you're also reading your textbook. All right. I wish you good luck on this. Start studying hard.